All right, Megan, are you all set?
Yes, we're ready.
We're ready for, okay. Well, just first of all, again, thank you. Nice to meet all of you. It's always nice to close the circle on research, as I was telling Mark, just when things come back to the people they belong to. And, you know, for a scholar, that's a real dream, especially when you work in historical periods that are in the past, to know and be in touch with contemporary people. And knowing that this is your history, it means a great deal to me to talk with you. You know, and in part of my research, I was trying to keep up with the Brotherton tribe history from its founding in the 1780s through the 19th century. And then I had the benefit of being in touch with some of the Brotherton community tribal leadership as I was doing research. And I guess I would just, you know, welcome a rundown from you all first. Just can you fill me in on how things are with you all, how your community is doing? I mean, clearly you have this robust online thing, you know, online way of being in touch with each other. So, you know, how are you guys? Collectively. Don't all chime in at once. So your group is called Brotherton Forward. Why is it called Brotherton Forward?
Well, I think it came out of a sort of a frustration with the political situation, and so we decided to come up with 4 major planks about reforms that we wanted to see within the tribe. Yeah. And so we created a website. We created this Zoom vehicle, and it's something that we're promoting, that we want the council to adopt, have them Zoom all of the council meetings, so members wherever they reside can participate in those meetings, and advocating for more transparency and accountability. And so it's embracing technology to help make that happen. Mm-hmm. And because we are so dispersed, I think, you know, it is increasingly important that we reach out to wherever our members reside and provide a forum for them to participate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. It's clear you're engaged in some pretty important work. So I appreciate that.
And then Amy and Megan and Paul are also founding members of Brotherton Forward. So please add to what I've said.
I don't think I have much to add other than our hope is to encourage community building by having this sort of online forum. How do we build this sort of shared experiences with each other when we live so far apart from one another? And so by inviting guest speakers, sharing stories ourselves, even Raven hosts sort of let's chat, sort of informal, hey, you know, folks who can meet up, let's meet up and talk about nothing and talk about everything. We really are just trying to figure out ways in which to bridge the divide.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the divide, you mean geographical, being apart from?
Geographical, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anything else to add, Megan?
No, I don't really have anything to add other than I guess I'd say, you know, us meeting together, Brotherton Forward, although Mark stated our goals, I think another effect of this, bringing us closer together, is that we're learning more about our history and about our culture and about our people. And it's had very positive effects in that regard to me also.
Yep. And it is an important and fascinating history. You know, the period of time I studied were the circumstances in the 1730s through 1780s that led up to the founding of Brotherton. And, you know, I came to study Samson Occom because in the 1990s, there was a big effort to make sure American literature was actually reflective of America. And that meant changing textbooks and, you know, redesigning courses, especially college courses, so that we didn't read, even from the earliest historical periods, we didn't read only dead white males. We read stories that reflected the breadth of experience. And It was a really interesting, wonderful time period in which, we were really kind of, the assumption was always there's nothing, right? Native people didn't write. African-American people didn't write. Not true. And especially if you open the definition of what writing is, which was a project we undertook a little later, like in the early 2000s. If you think of writing only as what happens when a pen touches a page, you miss most of the writing of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And so wampum belts are a form of writing. Carving is a form of writing. Beadwork is absolutely a form of writing. I mean, it's pixels. It's pixels, weaving is a form of writing. All of it. Anything where you are making marks that have marks in a pattern that have significance, we now view as writing. And with this expanded definition, we were able to draw in so many more texts of experience that allowed us, when we taught our courses, to teach our students about American history from many perspectives, American experience from many perspectives. So Samson Occom had been known to many people because he has a 1768 autobiography that's really short, but it tells his sort of conversion to Christianity. And that had already made it into a lot of anthologies, and people knew that text. And they knew one other sermon that he had written in 1773, given and written in 1773, that had been published in a lot of places as well. And on the basis of these two things, the thought was, he learned to read and write because of Christianity, and he was sort of a convert, and does that mean he's a sellout? People wrestled with that. Even, the very progressive people who joined us.
It means people joined us.
All right, good. Even the very, should we pause? I want to let you be a good host, Megan.
You're muted.
Sorry. I think we should just keep going because people are probably going to pop in all loud.
Okay, good. All right.
Right.
So, the very progressive people who, work on these projects didn't necessarily understand the role of religion in early communities of color in America. And, the assumption was, if you converted to Christianity, you were foregoing or erasing or evacuating, when you were baptized, your indigenous identity. And that's a purely European, Eurocentric point of view. There's a great image from Louise Erdrich, the native novelist Louise Erdrich. In one of her novels, she talks about all faith as being this giant world tree, and Christianity being like a branch off it, and being all part of the same. Oh, hang on, I have child. Pause. I'm speaking with a tribe I'm speaking. I have a wonderful 13-year-old. No, yes, go away.
This is great. This could go viral.
Goodbye.
This is how we get viral opportunities. It happened in
Yes, you
England
can
recently.
wash your laundry. Yes. Ella, go away. I love you.
I can do it myself, so how do I do it?
No, Ella, I'm right now on YouTube. Go away. Go.
How are you?
That's my 13-year-old.
Hello.
She's trying to do her laundry. These are members of the Brotherton tribe. Go away. Go away and wash your laundry. Go.
What? I don't know how to do it.
I will help you when I'm done. Go away. I'm not pleased with you. Go away. Go.
You have a nice child. You have a nice
She's
family.
She's marvelous. Cannot believe you did
Thank
that. Anyway, YouTube.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, she argued very well. Anyway, so the assumption was that when you converted, it evacuated your native identity. And that's a Eurocentric point of view. And that's not how Samson Occom saw it. But that only becomes clear when you look at the vaster body of his writings and when you put them in the context of the story of his life. And really through the writings that are more detailed and more day-to-day, get a sense of what Christianity meant to him, what his conversion meant to him, and to all the people who joined in the Brotherton Project. Another figure that we have a wonderful archive on is Joseph Johnson, who, do you know his work? You know his book. Oh, are you studying him?
Also, yeah.
He is an amazingly energetic. What a man. I mean, but, to Occom and Johnson, Christianity was a language for uniting fragments. It was a way of bringing together communities that had been so significantly impacted by Christianity, but it wasn't washing out those communities. It was giving them a new shared language for being together, crossing older differences, and thinking about what progress might look like for them, thinking about how to regenerate and heal, how to self-govern. And, their spirituality was authentic. I mean, they clearly found something in Christianity that spoke to them, but it spoke to them as indigenous people. And it served their purposes as community leaders. Especially Occom, who'd come from sort of a traditional family line and came of age in the tribe at a time when there was tremendous controversy over land bases and a lot of governmental infighting. And, so many Native people in New England especially, we look at, we know they knew how important writing was in order to hold on to land. And the place to learn to write was at church and in church schools. So, Occom, enters Eliezer Wheelock's school, learns to read and write, also learns leadership, learns a kind of leadership language that might fill in some of the gaps in his own community, which is really under pressure and really a bit fragmented and controversy crossed. So a new way of expressing a leadership voice. Travels, goes to England, sees the world, and then travels extensively. I think, and this is something I think is really poignant given how you all are dispersed and yet maintain your ties via technology. He traveled constantly between different spots where different Native folks who were kin. And, his spouse was Montaukett, and so we taught in Montauk for a while. And so he's always back and forth across the Sound, but he was always just visiting in the area, just visiting. And then when the first group went up to Brotherton in New York from southern New England, he was back and forth all the time, well into advanced age, and even after injury, at great physical pain. So, he understood what it meant to maintain ties during a period of extreme impact from colonialism, but then also during the Revolutionary War. So he traveled most of his adult life. But the founding of Brotherton was one of the most joyful moments in all of the writings that I collected, and pulled together. His feelings when he comes through the forest and after a long journey comes out and finds Brotherton intact and finds a community of about 200 people there and finds them singing together and conducts the first marriage at Brotherton. And those rituals, the singing especially, Joseph Johnson's work shows how critical the singing was. So anyway, that's how Occom came to my notice. I was a scholar of early American literature and of early American literature of color, and no one seemed to know how to talk about the religion in all of it, African American and Native American communities, without seeing it immediately as a sign that they'd sold out. So, my argument in my first book was it was their way of forging communities in places where there'd been some real disruption to traditional lines of community descent, right? Some traditional rituals, place-based stuff had been really disrupted for African communities, African American communities and Native American communities. And so there's a new form of leadership that emerges in the spaces of the church or in the space of the religious gathering. And that's an argument actually Melissa Tanaquid had made in Mohegan's argument for recognition, was that, you have to show this continuous leadership structure in order to qualify, as you all well know. And, her argument was, don't look for the conventional sacrum continuing, at a certain point, the leadership structure morphs and it blends with the church and it continues in a sociocultural leadership way long after, the federal government or the dominant colonizers thoroughly undermine, scatter, blow up traditional tribal councils. So leadership has always shifted and always morphed. Governance has always shifted and always morphed as it's needed to. But the thing that holds it all together is the maintenance of relationships. So, which is really great. That's what I'm seeing here. All right, so one story I want to share with you, and then I would just love to be more Q&A back and forth, and we can, I picked out some stuff from the writings, that might be interesting to share and talk about. But when I was deep in the research, and the research for me meant doing a lot of just transcribing and then checking the transcriptions and then annotating the transcriptions to put them in the right historical context, make it useful. And so when I was really immersed in the transcription and the checking of it, I had a dream that I was in upstate New York, and I had a dream that someone was speaking the language, and it was sort of creating like a path through the space, right? A path through the woods around, and this was Occom's territory. I knew it was Occom's territory. I'm trying to remember if he came in the dream as well, but it was this really vivid, beautiful dream about the power of language and place, and what that meant to his community. And unfortunately, there's only smatterings of his language in the journals, like he will in the letters. And I remember sharing with, I think one of the Fieldings who was working on one of the linguists at Mohegan,
Stephanie?
a word that I'd found in one of the letters, and here you go. The amazing work that folks have done to reconstruct languages, and what that does in terms of bringing you back in connection with a place is so complementary and so sweetly parallel to the work of visiting and seeing each other and maintaining kinship ties that way. So I offer that. Just wanted to share that with you. It was one of the best experiences of my research on this book, was having that very sweet dream. So anyway, what can I answer in terms of questions? And I might go in because my neighbor started a leaf blower. Don't want to be on leaf blower.
I have a question that I had been wanting to ask you forever, and
Yeah.
probably won't know the answer, but what happened to Occom's 1767 journal? He started the journal when he was in England at 65, and then we don't have the rest of the journals. Do we know where they were? How did Dartmouth get the 1765 journal? Where could the other journals be?
Right. I puzzled at that a long time. No one has what we call accession records. I'm not even clear how Dartmouth came into possession of so much. It makes sense that Connecticut has, they have, of course, all of the Wheelock correspondence. So it could be at some point far past, they made a concerted effort to acquire more. They don't have records on it at the Special Collections Library. Connecticut Historical Society makes more sense to me, and they do have a bunch of his stuff. I think a writing desk of his ended up there.
Really?
That's a note I came across somewhere. So
I've heard something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and so it could be that the desk contained papers. There was an incident, one of the things that struck me is I know he lost a lot of his library once when he was crossing the Long Island Sound.
That's true, but that's before the trip to England, so it doesn't get at Megan's question about that journal in particular.
Right. But what it does show for me is that, archives
The fragility of collection.
They're very vulnerable, and especially people who might be living or moving a lot.
Yeah.
It's really difficult. So you think about like your standard colonial white guy who's in a position of comfort, who doesn't move much at all and has a big institution and just sits there and writes, versus, people who are moving because they had to, moving because they wanted to, always traveling back and forth. So yeah, fragility is the right word, I think. So I don't know, Megan. I wish I could answer that. If I knew where it was, I'd find it.
I know.
And I did what you have to do when you're doing an edition. You do kind of reach out to all the libraries you can think of and say, do you have anything?
So did you contact London, people in England, or was it just in the States?
That's a good question. I could look back at my notes. I don't remember. I don't know if I contacted England, but that would be obvious. Yeah, are you on? That might be. I would look for anyone who had the papers of those missionary societies.
Yeah. I thought about contacting some of the churches and the local or the national, what do they call it? They had a word for it, national something. Anyway, there were several places there I thought about contacting, and I've come across several old writings. There's a little booklet of sermons that he had that wasn't in your book, and there were
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's written by, how did it word it? Written by a youth. He apparently followed Occom around for a couple of weeks or so. There's 6 to 9 sermons. You didn't know this?
Where'd you find this? This is awesome.
Amazon, eBay, somewhere somebody had reprinted it, photocopied them where it had been printed originally, and they photocopied it.
Holy moly.
I can send you copies of that if you want. It's not very big.
I think I remember coming across this. But yeah, no, I'll look for it. I'll Google it.
And then there were several, I'm trying to find as many newspapers from that time as I can. And of course, that's difficult because nobody catalogs it by Occom, or very little of it is cataloged by Occom. It's, John Hancock or whoever, famous people. So it's not easy to find, but if I can find a date, I'll go through and I'll look through things, and sometimes I can find little articles, his time in there. So those are interesting.
Oh, that's great.
He had apparently, the wampum belt sent over to him that the United had given him, which you make it sound in the article like it was right before he left, but it was like years before he left. He had this wampum belt, and I guess he took it to Wheelock. I'm not sure, but anyway, and then Wheelock had it sent over along with other things.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I remember that. There's a bunch of Indian stuff, right? Because he
showed to the people. Mm-hmm.
Really, I swear. Look. Yeah, I mean, that was the whole balance of his life, was trying to make muster and, demonstrate his, I know you know how this feels, time and time again. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. The ways Native people have to show who they are to people who are not Native is oftentimes different. Native people understand who they are in their own terms. So he had to do that.
Yep. And that was the whole reason, of course, he wrote his autobiography.
Was to authenticate his identity.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which thank goodness he did.
Now, I saw several of you were nodding when I was talking about singing. So tell me about the role singing has played in the longer history of the tribe.
Well, Gabriel might be best to answer that. He gave us a talk on it. To be honest, I don't know that we knew very much other than Occom had a hymnal in 1774, and Thomas Kamuk had a hymnal in 1865. And at least to me, I didn't know there was much of a connection in there, despite having read Occam's stuff, and the singing here and there. It didn't dawn on me, but then I discovered Gabriel, and he kind of filled me in on stuff.
Right. There was no obvious connection at first, but I've been myself for decades, for decades officially, and there's autobiography backstory that is still just kind of lurking, that brings me even further back to childhood, that connects me with shape note music. But for decades, I've been singing in community with Sacred Harp singers, with shape note singers. And I, despite my institutional conservatory classical music training, I could recognize that there was really something different and community-based and non-professional, non-performative, but with so many other dimensions just really important and compelling going on. There's just so much going on in this tradition, which is an unbroken, continuous tradition, goes back to the colonial New England singing schools. And it's really this tradition plus the rural England West Gallery music traditions that sort of fused together, and in North America, in British North American colonies, became what became, after the invention of the shape notes, the shape note singing tradition. And the biggest title still in print, continuously in print since 1844, and in use most popular worldwide today in that tradition, is the Sacred Harp. But I would agree with like the image we've already heard from Louise Erdrich of the one big tree and all the different branches. The Sacred Harp and the shape note are kind of like that. They're just they're branches on this big tree, and but it was my familiarity and participation in that just made me know. I knew in my gut, a book like Thomas Comuc's doesn't come from nowhere. There's a community behind this, and the traces in the common literature, common or European or whatever, just the traces in the literature didn't exist, obviously. And I've been for several years just trying to fill in the blanks there. Like I knew there was a community, and I'm just trying to find it. And yeah, we're finding each other. And I very wide reading and just following people's bibliographies leads me just to place after place after place. One journal here, one letter there, another newspaper here, and just just little bits. If one is well versed in the jargon and the specifics of and a lot of the repertoire in poetry and music of hymnody, then tiny clues, just a single tune name, just a single phrase of text can demonstrate a connection with an entire stream of tradition and prove these connections pretty clearly, and just bit by bit with those kind of things, I've actually filled in the decades all the way between Occom and Comuc, and proven the connection and the continuity all the way. There was singing by just everybody, the entire community of Brotherton Indians at home and on the road in all of those decades, from southern New England to New York to Wisconsin and everywhere in between. I love Joanna Brooks, in your collection of the Samson Occom writings. We get two views, very different views, and the differences in how Occom and Joseph Johnson, how they present to fellow natives as versus how they present to Europeans, what they write in their journal, what they send out in their letters. And they seem very conscious that the letters are going to Wheelock and they're going to missionary fundraising boards, and they write sort of fundraising propaganda, and they give more of certain kinds of details, and then in their own letters and journals they give less of those details, but they might say something else, and then you put together those two accounts, and then you really get something. An example of that, as mentioned, how much Occom traveled back and forth, and was almost like the ferryman for everyone else making the move. Page 124. Page 124 in here, a letter to Solomon Wells, 1784, September 1784. And then comparing that with his own journals up around pages 285, 286, describing the same encounters. We get more of the names of the family and the relatives and exactly who was on that trip. And this is the trip that I described as like the Mohegan version of the Von Trapp family singers. Here's the people who are, being displaced, becoming refugees, facing tyranny, oppression, just getting freaked out of there, getting away. And, one of them are singing The Sound of Music, going over the hills, getting over the border. And the other ones are singing this English language Christian hymnody. And, Occom writes in his writings, we were all good singers. And then you look at his other writings, figure out who those people are. It's his daughter, Christiana. It's the Narragansetts, Anthony and John Paul, that she's married. It's their mother. It's people who were not in Wheelock's school. It's family, but they're all good singers. And he specifies, psalm tunes and anthems, which is not simple music. This is fancy, extended through composed, complicated, difficult to memorize music that goes way beyond just a verse that gets repeated. It just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And he says they're singing those things. They're all good. And these are people that weren't at Wheelock's school. It's proof that the Indians have taken it, made it their own. They're teaching each other, and they can take it on the road, and they're so good and they're so fluent with it. They just sing, and people give up money, and they can continue their trip. And they moved on it. And that's how they moved. In that particular trip. It's a really interesting story that really stood out to me. And I give that as an example of how just little clues, just knowing what an anthem is and how that's different from a plain tune. Since I'm coming from the musical side as a singer and by training, those little stories have a whole different resonance for me, and I can pick out the clues and follow those. rambling answer, but something about the continuity and how it was spreading amongst the Indians by their own actions and continuing through the decades. And just that one example.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're finding sorry, yeah.
Oh, sorry. One of the other things as I was reviewing the writings for today was, in addition, again, to being struck by movement, by language, by singing, by visiting, but also by the constant struggle to establish, and, I know these are really sensitive topics, but it's right there, the constant struggle to establish governance on their own terms and maintain that. So they get to Brotherton in 1785, and by 1788, there's very serious factionalism, very, very serious, and it has to do with land. And they're in some tension with the Oneida, who don't want them to do bounded plots, right? So they're used to having bounded plots of land, sort of rationalizing land use within the town. And the Oneida don't necessarily feel that that's safe. The United pressure them to come back on and not have bounded. And being New England Indians, they've taken the lesson that having contract, having legal title, having bounded plots of land is the only way to keep the land. And the Oneida, of course, being in a sort of a different place and a different context, feel more safe in the unboundedness. And one of the things that was probably happening was when plots were held by individual families, which Native people in New England had to do in order to be recognized by colonial legal systems, they were more vulnerable to being expropriated. So if someone fell into hard times and there was a more vulnerable member of the family, the risk that someone would sell the land was greater when the land was bounded into small plots. So one of the later documents in his life, after petitioning so many times for self-determination, the last petition Occom writes is this petition asking government to take away the power from people to sell, from Native people at Brotherton to sell their own land. He's doing it, and there's open conflict in tribal meetings. People are making fun of him. Younger generations are making fun of him. He's an elder at this point. He's about almost 70. Which is quite a bit, significant longevity for that period of time. And it's just open, painful conflict over these land issues. So, it seems to be a point of continuity to the, certainly through the 19th century history I'm familiar with. How do you keep a connection to a place when there's so many forces pressing in around you, economic forces, historical forces, wars, just economic duress? How do you hold on, given the importance of land to Native people? And so one of the things I think is fascinating about Brotherton and its resilience is that yours is a community that has moved at least twice, 2 land bases. And so, it kind of leads me to wonder, what was the role of land? Those of you who grew up with Brotherton identification or were raised to know yourself as Brotherton people, did you visit places that meant Brotherton to you? Did you ever go back to some of the older places with your families or with other kin? Anyone want to give a stab at that?
Well, I never had a time in my life where I didn't know I was Brothertown, and but my identity of place is Gresham, Wisconsin, which is nowhere near Brothertown, Wisconsin. And my father had talked to me about New York and our time in New York as a kid, but it was it didn't mean anything to me until I moved to New England. And then I happen to be driving in Western Massachusetts and I see a town that says Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And I'm like, wait, stop.
Stop the car.
Because I got cousins in Stockbridge, but not, Stockbridge that's in, Bowler, Wisconsin.
Right.
But it was such a weird experience not knowing our ties to this area, but yet finding my life bringing me here. And then as soon as I get here, I meet Indians from Aquinnah. I meet Indians from Mashpee. I meet Indians from Narragansett and Nipmuc, and they say, "Oh, what tribe are you?" And it's the first time I said Brotherton, and they said, "Hey, welcome home." And I didn't have to explain who I was or who my people were. And I happened to go to Mohegan for a spring social, and I meet one of their tribal councilmen. And he says, "Oh, you're Brotherton, what's your family last name?" And I tell him my family last name, and he says, "You've got Mohegan roots." And then he takes me to their cemetery and shows me where my ancestors are buried. And it just a physicality that I'd never experienced before, because in my head, Brothertown was Gresham, was my family in Gresham and Red Springs, and just this tiny little community. And the relationship that I had with my Menominee relatives and my Stockbridge relatives and my Oneida relatives, that was my place. And I never saw my place in Brothertown, Wisconsin or New York until I got older.
Wow. That's remarkable. Those are really beautiful stories. Thank you. Going back, and that must be nice to be near Southern New England again, huh?
It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. And I'm really thankful that my children get to be here. Yeah, it's really wonderful.
And to be recognized by other people.
Yeah, well, and I've always been recognized anywhere, but to not have to explain, that was the thing. Oh, so Brothertown? Brotherhood? What's your tribe? It was really great. Yeah.
What about you, Megan? Did you grow up with a relationship to place in New York or just Wisconsin, or?
No, I really didn't. I mean, my grandmother, the only time I remember anything about Brotherton before I was 18 or so was my grandmother gave me a necklace one time, and she said, "Well, we're Indian, we're Brotherton," and gave me a necklace, and that's it. That's my only memory of it whatsoever.
A very common story, right? People who don't really learn till later because people had to hide for so many reasons. Mm-hmm. Mark, did your family ever visit New York area or?
Not New York, but my grandfather was very involved in tribal affairs from maybe 1900s until he died in 1930. And that was in the period of the Kellogg affair. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was a land claim case back in New York, and Laura Kellogg was an Oneida Indian, and her husband Orrin had these dues-paying clubs throughout Wisconsin. So it was called the Six Nations Club. And so my grandfather would rent a car and drive back to Brotherton. He was born in Quincy. So he would go back and visit them, and he was, like I said, involved with that whole Kellogg affair. And so if you're not familiar with that, there was, I don't know if you ever heard of John Tercensky. This is probably early 1980s, came out and did a whole, I don't know if it was their dissertation or just a thesis on the Kellogg affair. So it documented a lot of these Six Nations clubs and how Brothertons were involved in this, and it was in relation to the land claim case in New York. But again, it was, I think the case was eventually dismissed, but a lot of Brothertons were defrauded, lost, a lot of their savings, and by making contributions to these Six Nations clubs.
Yeah.
That's painful.
So, and again, a lot of this history was lost because my grandfather died in 1930, and when my dad was 11 years old. So, I've been involved in the reorganizational efforts since about 1979. So, been involved in relearning a lot of that of our history.
The work of sovereignty is hard work.
Yeah.
Very detailed. Yeah. Well, what other questions can I answer for you about this time long ago when everything started? Or not when everything, but I mean when Brotherton, the name came into being to represent the effort.
Thank you, Ms. Brooks, for joining us. Thank you very much for the wealth of information, too. A question I had, you stated that Samson Occom, Reverend Occom, did quite a bit of traveling while he was in a great deal of pain resulting from an injury. Could you maybe expand a little bit on that?
He had various, you can track various health problems throughout his life. Eyesight, eye strain, he had very bad eye strain from early that seemed to have resolved. Otherwise, I don't think he would be able to keep up the journaling. And the journals are small. The journals are about that big when you hold them. But he slipped on ice in about 1780 and incurred a hip injury. So you can imagine how painful riding on horseback or traveling.
There's something with like trying to hook up a wagon to an animal and slipping and like the wagon and the animal landing on them or something like that. I think, it was like a lot of poundage, like landing on him. It was bad. Yeah.
And he worked, it's interesting. I noticed a lot of the men in the community were always out and about. And I sensed that was continuity with older patterns of social organization, men traveling a lot. And, I knew that in some of the Northeastern indigenous nations, land rights were actually vested in women, that women more closely identify the land. But Occom, so it made sense at one point. I was thinking, okay, so I can see all of these men who are native who become, and they traveled as whalers, they traveled in so many different ways, traders, then on whaling ships, and then this, missionaries who are emissaries between different communities. It seemed in continuity with this older pattern of men in the community being more mobile and women being more identified with the land. But really, Occom did both. He did take care of, when he got back from his travels, he was very much engaged in the life of the home, and he had a lot of mouths to feed.
Kids. I have kind of a two-pronged question.
And thank you for your question, by the way.
Thanks. One just, simple in general. I haven't seen in any published work anywhere anything but references or suppositions. Has any kind of actual written music notation associated with Occom ever been found anywhere? That's one question, simple to ask, hard to answer. And a second one, you mentioned, Joanna, earlier, a first book. Did you mean American Lazarus? Whether you meant that or not, I want to give a holler out to American Lazarus, which is just awesome through and through. Thank you. And I wonder whether you have since that time found any other connections between hymnody works of Samson Occom and Richard Allen? Any other connections between the native hymnody practice and African American, especially Methodist practice that Richard Allen was involved with? Richard Allen, founder of AME Church and active in the same Revolutionary era in Philadelphia area and Delaware circuit of the Methodists. Just backstory briefly for people. Yeah.
So Occom did visit down that way. He visited some of the Lenape people because he had relative. The history is relationship between Mohegan people as a branch of the Natchez people. And he made different efforts. I think it was a trip to Philadelphia and different efforts at fundraising in and around that area as well. But I haven't found any documented connection between Occom and Allen. He did know Phyllis Wheatley, but she wasn't, Amy wasn't around yet when she was, so.
And she was Massachusetts based, the other direction, yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the culture in southern New England was exceedingly, especially around some of those towns that were closer to the coast, was very, very diverse. You know, the Mashpee were mentioned a few minutes ago, and you remember the whole Mashpee recognition struggle was that so many people had so long assumed Mashpee to be African American. When you look at William Apess, it's in the 1830s. He was identified always as African American when his primary identity was indigenous. You know, as he represented. So to
I just think of him as so Mohegan. I didn't realize he ever was considered African. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So Mohegan. Wow, amazing.
Yeah. So a lot of tribal communities in southern New England, especially on the coast and around port towns, were very mixed race places. And just in terms, you know, and that didn't matter to Native people. That didn't matter at all. Phenotype is not how Native people know each other and see each other. It's, you know, the language, and you show up and you know, I mean, you maintain your relations. That's how Native people recognize each other, not by phenotype. That was all a bad, strange, brave new world that colonialism brought into play. So what you have in, and the whaling culture totally contributed to that as well, because whaling culture was very heterogeneous, and, you know, you had people from all over the world coming into contact on whalers and exchanging culture and learning each other's languages. And so there was just a lot of Black Native interaction in those contexts. And what grows out of it then, in southern New England especially, is the Protestant movement from the 1740s to the 1780s is especially intense in southern New England, in some of the areas where Joseph Johnson is, and in some of the first areas Brotherton starts organizing. And they called them New Lights. And the New Lights were very progressive in terms of race. So you have mixed race meetings. And just a lot, and, you know, race wasn't quite as fixed back then the way we've come to think of it now. Like, it was a lot more fluidity. I mean, it still mattered, especially in the context of slavery and chattel slavery, but New Lights were fervently anti-slavery. They were big on the hymns. And they had these sort of impromptu house gatherings all the time. And Brotherton kind of emerges out of this New Light context. So, you know, it was a very fusion culture. The Christian culture was very fusion. So, you know, we can't put Richard Allen and Samson Occom in the same room, but they were on the same circuits.
Right.
And you know, thinking about culture as traveling, like you said, you know, they traveled on their music, and the music traveled too. So, but to the question of actual musical notes, I pondered and searched a bit over that too. Johnson's book is really clear that he's hand-picking gamuts.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And then you're familiar with those, right? And those are, so, but at the same time, you know, there was a basic repertoire of tunes that they could command, you know, that were known to anybody who sort of moved in Christian circles. So they'd say, oh, let's sing this to this. And they could, you know, learn by ear and then put it to whatever set of words were in front of them. So I haven't found in Occom's body of manuscripts tune books other than, you know, at Dartmouth there is, have you been to the Dartmouth Special Collections Library?
I need to get to Roundner. I haven't been there yet, no.
There's I can see it in my mind's eye. It's like this big. It wasn't Occom's, it was later. The paper was later. But I want to say it was Kamuxera. There's like a tune book like that big.
Oblong. Yeah, like this kind of dimension. But yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And it's from Kamuxera, not from Occom's, but it's in his papers.
It's in Occom's papers?
Yeah, so I don't know why it's there. Maybe they've cataloged it differently now, but I just remember it being there. But it wasn't from his era. The paper was wrong, the writing was wrong, the binding was wrong. It wasn't his, but it's with his stuff. So the only evidence of notes and musicality I've been able to find in his stuff is just, the two names and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
Johnson Gammas.
The book you mentioned, Out of Era at Dartmouth, was that manuscript or printed?
Manuscript.
Manuscript. Yep. Wow.
There's something there, yeah.
Yep.
Maybe
Great.
I'll find it.
Awesome. Thank
Go
you.
to Router's pretty neat.
Yeah.
I have a question. You alluded to Occom's later years and that there was some division about him trying to protect the land. And my question is, do you think that was primarily the reason that he went and ended his days with the Stockbridge? Or do you think it was he was being rivaled by other preachers that had come along among the Brotherton?
I think it's the land crises. There's a name that comes up a lot, Elijah Wimpy or Wampy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And, he seemed to have been pretty a provocative personality. And he seemed to sort of was stirring the pot a bit. And, and we don't have enough, we don't have anything from Wampy's point of view. So we have no way of knowing other than, he sort of moves like a comet across the screen, in Occom's writings. But, Occom is very uncomfortable whenever he's around. And he ridicules Occom at a couple meetings. He's younger, and Occom associates him with a certain disorderliness. And I think, Wampy's probably just a young man who's coming of age who's saying, why did we move up here? We're poor as dirt, things are not necessarily better. We'd had these high hopes. The whole vision is not quite playing out as we'd hoped. That's what I get from him. That kind of, and the energy of the new young generation leadership challenging the older generation leadership, saying, you had a vision, but it's not working out.
Wasn't Elijah Wampy the same man who went with Joseph Johnson to go out to that first trip to Oneida to look for land, to try to get the land from Oneida?
Yeah.
Four of them set out, and Johnson and one other went.
I forget that trip exactly, but I do remember or believe, for whatever reasons, I can't give a footnote exact, but I believe Elijah Wampy was in Farmington when Joseph Johnson was working there, and that he was heavily invested in the whole Brothertown immigration project and was pretty closely associated with Johnson and with the beginnings of it all. And so he this idea that we hear now that he was just really heavily into it, and then he's set up for a possible disappointment and could get rancorous about that. That all kind of makes sense. And I'm such a fan of Joseph Johnson. I just reverberate so much with his writings that it kind of lets me down. I'm like, no, you're Joseph Johnson friend. Don't be mean to Samson Occom. Come on. But I think those connections are true, and it's part of what is so confusing about Elijah Wampy and all these developments into the New York Brothertown that make it uncomfortable for Occom. And he moves in with the Stockbridge for the final years. It's
I think
it's interesting.
There was even a physical altercation, right in town.
I think once, yeah.
And so I get the sense that he's getting on in years, and it's way up there, and he was capable of being angry, as he should have been with all that he saw.
Fair enough. Yep.
He comes back from England and he's mad. And, the next time we see him, he has to show up and make an apology for having drank too much, and he's reported by contemporaries being the most anti-white Indians you'd ever met. But you won't know that until you read deep into the archive. And it wasn't a disregard born of lack of familiarity. He knew that. He did in white circles and just, seen so much dissolve and so much have to be put back together time and time again. And, any community, religious, doesn't matter what, schism happens, fragmentation happens, anger happens. And, Occom had been through 3 morphs, at least, with this group of people he loved and was trying to find the right angle to hold them together. He was a leader. he felt deep responsibility. And, here he is getting very on in age and things are very painful and it looks like it's not quite working out. And I can imagine he felt like it was the end of the road. But those are some of his finest moments in terms of writing as well. He writes these sermons in which he's the most critical of colonialism and of European civilization and what it all had introduced to Native North American civilization. He calls out Captain Cook in the South Pacific introducing the French, French pot. It's remarkable if you think about back then. Native people in North America are 100% are in touch with Native people in the South Pacific, and they recognize parallel circumstances. And there's some evidence that already, if you think of the whaling histories, Native people from New England have already been to the South Pacific by the late 18th century. There's pretty much no doubt of that.
Matthew, do you want to talk about?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we hear you now.
Okay, good. I just want to say first and foremost, I'm not affiliated with the Brotherton tribe. I came across this on WordPress, and I saw that Joanna was talking, and a lot of the work that I do as a scholar has to do with interactions between Native American, African American culture. So I was really intrigued, and I apologize for barging in, but I'm teaching Occom actually with Apis on Friday again. So going back to the question, I think a couple, maybe 2 questions ago about the interactions between Native American and African American, and you mentioned Richard Allen. I'm curious to know if you know of anything. I know about Wheatley. Anything with, say, Equiano or Morant, or even Paul Cuffey, who I believe was indigenous as well.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what tribe.
Montauk or Wampanoag, southern New England. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
And I know Morant, I don't know, I just know he was a free person of color. He was actually from
He's from South Carolina.
South Carolina,
Yeah.
but he went to Nova Scotia. He went to the Northeast
Right.
during the same period. So I was just curious if you knew of anything. And they were all related to the Countess of Huntington, too, to a certain extent. Wheatley and Morant and Equiano.
A network. She was trying to recruit, people to be emissaries of Christianity. So, my daughter is singing. Hang on. Let me think. So, in terms of more connections with African American communities, well, one thing we know is that Occom was opposed to slavery and was critical of slavery, as were many Lewites. It comes up and it appears in sermons in the book from later in his life. I mean, he was just completely, how can you be a Christian and be a slaveholder? So he was fiercely anti-slavery. And he had a lot of mixed race, what we would call mixed race people on a day-to-day basis. And that was a reality in native New England from the 17th century. So, if you think of a world in which it's a bit more fluid in terms of racial identification, not that race didn't matter and didn't exist, especially for Black people, but, Occom would have moved comfortably in almost any circle. Now, we don't have any evidence of contact that I can recall with him and any of the other major Black authors of the moment. I'm trying to remember, except for Wheatley. Hope that helps. I'm looking through the index of the book to see if I see any names that stick out. I shouldn't remember.
Were the New Lights Methodists?
Yeah, no, not specifically. So Methodism doesn't organize until a little bit later, formally. So the New Lights are just sort of a separatist, evangelical Protestant movement. They're coming out of the Congregationalist churches in southern New England. Anything else I can answer?
Did you come across a sense of humor?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there. I'm trying to remember specific instances. Because isn't that the challenge? We find, there's some early letters to his spouse
Yeah, I'm looking for that.
that are really nice.
To his daughters, where he says something about, I arrived, what was the word? He uses over.
That's That's to his wife. That's to his wife. Yeah. Yeah. It's hilarious. Just hilarious.
Yeah.
Or even also besides that one, when he gets snarky and says, you know, when he gets back from England, having raised all these pledges and funds, and then Wheelock is like, "Great, thanks. I'm going to New Hampshire. Goodbye." You know, that was like kind of like the final straw. Like, okay, let's make Brothertown. But he writes to Wheelock his dissatisfaction, saying, I mean, multilingual punning. He says, "I fear that your institution has." My alma mater has become, you know, too alma to alba to suckle the Tawnies. I fear my alma mater has become too alba to suckle the Tawnies. It's just too white. Okay, Wheelock, go ahead, go to New Hampshire, be white, and go away. You know, it's just, but he says it in Latin, and it's so funny. It's except it's not funny. It's so tragic. It's really like the last straw, and it was bad. You know, it's just a bad thing. But Occom was very civilized and funny about it, and more power to him, you know.
And I like remembering that he started his career teaching children on Long Island, teaching in Montauk, and he developed
the flashcards. Yeah.
And he had these things he called Christian cards he carried and interchanged with as he traveled. So sort of like, I think like it sounds like they were like fortune telling cards, but they had scriptures on them. So someone would pull out the card. What's your scripture? Like your fortune cookie almost. So I mean, he had a playful approach. And definitely comes out in relationship with his family.
I got that one letter to his wife. It's pretty brief. If you want to hear,
Yeah.
More Samson Occom humor. Samson Occom humor. It's on. It's in here, page 78. 1766. It is addressed both to Mary Fowler Occom, his wife, and Esther Poquenta Fowler. My dear Mary and Esther, perhaps you may query whether I am well. I came from home well, was by the way well, got over well, am received at London well, and am treated extremely well. Yea, I am caressed too well, and do you pray that I may be well, and that I may do well, and in time return home well. And I hope you are well, and wish you well, and as I think you begun well, so keep on well, that you may end well, and then all will be well. And so, farewell, Samson Occom.
Exactly, and that's a gorgeous sense of humor for the 18th century, really. I mean, yeah, no. So Mark, yeah, I really like to think of Occom as human, fully human. He really was, you know, and that's one of the important things when you move out away from the narrowest way he was represented for so many years on the basis of the autobiography and the sermon, and you really find the larger body of writings, and you find he's very worldly aware. He gets angry. He condemns, you know, colonial culture pretty strongly. He gets frustrated. He gets disappointed. He's sad. And he has a sense of humor as well. All of those things. He would have to be to engage people over such a long period of time in that community building project, right? He'd have to be, he did not last just a season. You know, he had a lot of pressure on him for, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
A little just tangent, returning back to a Matthew question, if you got eyeballs. Interesting book reference.
Yeah.
Did I have to write it backwards? That doesn't show up right, does it? I see it backwards, but you see it right ways around, right?
That was actually on myself.
Yeah. That's interesting book, and it has some Occom reference, but also just interesting look at just the thinking of the times with a lot of research, a lot of viewpoints, interesting perspectives in there.
Joanna, I have a question. When I first came up here, I happened to go to an event at Dartmouth, and they were talking about Samson. And when they did, they only mentioned his Mohegan roots. And then when I happened to mention I was Brothertown, then all of a sudden the conversation changed to, oh, yes, and we have to include. And I was like, you all weren't going to mention the Brothertown Indian Nation at all unless I was in the room. And wonder if that is a common occurrence with him in scholars in other areas. Do people just primarily focus on his Mohegan lineage and then disregard the Brothertown?
So the convention in, for example, like, literature and literature anthologies is to give the tribal affiliation in parentheses after the author's name. And you never see Brotherton, now that you mention it. You see Mohegan, but not Brotherton. And it should at least be Mohegan, semicolon, Brotherton. And I think, that's an oversight. That needs to be remedied. Great point.
That's something I've thought about too. I thought he was born Mohegan, but he died Brotherton. Even though he moved to Stockbridge, he was still Brotherton.
Well, I think it helps to identify that there's a more than a racial identity when it comes to Native people, that we have a political identity as well. And I think that's sometimes missing in academia, and hard for non-natives to understand if they don't know anything about Indian country or tribal history. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not missing only in academia. It's just kind of missing as a European concept. It looks differently at what is family, what is relationship, what is the membership. It is a very different thing. Yeah, these are good points. Thank you.
I think that's not on. I can't tell.
Yes.
I think that's interesting because I'm thinking about Apis too, because he's Mashpee as well.
We hear
and then even Easton. I'm trying to think of those I mentioned, but Easton and individuals like that, Paul Cuffey, they're typically labeled as African American, especially in literature and in literature textbooks, especially Cuffey and Easton. Even though Easton was Wampanoag, and I don't remember what Cuffey was, like I said, but that's really interesting.
Well, and it just shows you, what is the idea of a tribe and who does it belong to and how has it changed over time? So with federal recognition, Native people had to say, in order to get hold on to certain rights, people had to fit a certain very Western idea of nationhood. And really, sometimes I remember thinking once, well, a tribe is like, a picture of a stream, it keeps rolling. It's not the same water. Right. 10 years later. But, that's what folks had to do in order to qualify according to the colonial imagination for that right to self-determine politically.
Right.
I think you've made a really powerful point that will really shape me, Amy, when I talk and think and write about him going forward. You can't think about the origins. You got to think about, like Megan said, there's this transition of identity, and it's a political choice.
And it is hard to write. I think about this also, like in the example, say, of Thomas Kamuk. This is generations later, so he seems, just the political existence of Brothertown has been going on since before his birth. But he's born in, back in southern New England in Rhode Island, and moves to New York, and then is among the very first to move to Wisconsin, and writes, not founding, but seminal documents there in Wisconsin of Brothertown history, and I think of him as just Brothertown, really, but his Narragansett descent is important, and so maybe not just like this syntax of a name and a colon and a name, but I think of like Kamuk as Brotherton of Narragansett descent, is like kind of the syntax that I use and think of for that. And then there's like a primary and a descent line with it, and I don't know, I'm making that up. I don't know how people feel about that. But
ourselves now. I mean, we're all Brotherton, but we're always asking each other, well, where are you descended from? Well,
that's
I'm
right.
And you're Mohegan, and but it's this blending thing. It's not like we war with each other or anything like that, but we totally identify with our roots, and we're still Brotherton right now.
And that's a thing that was a thing even before the physical geographic move to Brothertown. If I just go back to that little, traveling Von Trapp family singer analog story with just that one example of Occom's daughter Christiana, who are the son-in-laws and the mother-in-law traveling with them? They're Narragansett. You know, there's and Occom and his wife is Mary Fowler, leading family of the Montauk. I mean, this marriage and relational connection, interconnection through all the groups. I usually end up using the word group just to avoid like all the possible missteps. Is it a tribe? Is it a nation? Is it this? Is it that? Well, you know, whatever. Right? They're all a family together. So just you know, this group and that group, and they're married together. I leave it at that. It's usually like my safe exit, you know. They were intermarried, connected even before Brotherton existed. It was all one community. The dialects and relations were close enough, and the geography close enough that it was very interconnected. As in all the known oral and written history that we have, even before Brotherton as a town.
And what marks you as belonging is understanding all those relationships, even if it takes a minute to spin them out, right?
Yeah. Well, especially if it takes a minute, because then like you understand it, you're in on it, you're an insider. All right, you know, yeah.
And that's why I think we see so much so much visiting. Visiting was so critical to his worldview. Being with and seeing people and having a meal with them and just reconnecting the ties and rehashing the stories to keep those ties very intricate, multi-community ties as they were. Yeah. Well, anything else I can answer for y'all? I mean, y'all know where to find me now. So if you have questions or if I can be useful to you, just let me know.
Joanna, this was so wonderful. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Right. And if you need any help with your research or anything, if I can be useful, just you know where to find me.
Yeah, and vice versa. I got the music angle, you know.
Yay!
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And good luck, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck with your teaching, Matthew.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you take care.
Y'all too.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.